Hello, Belinda.
Hello, Hugo. How are you?
I have to unmute myself, I think. Can you
No,
hear
I
me?
can.
Oh, you can hear me. Oh, good. Welcome, welcome. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. And you may notice there's a different backdrop. So welcome, everybody. I see we've been joined. I'm actually in Windhoek.
Lucky you.
Well, it's on work, but I am lucky. You're quite right. I'm quite blessed to be in Windhoek. I love Namibia, and it's been my first trip here since COVID struck. Can you believe it?
Wow. And you're seeing all our tutoring centers.
Correct. I'm actually at one of them right now. That's why the backdrop, because I had an event, I held an evening for the parents. They're still here, so you might occasionally hear kids in the background. They put on a whole performance. There was an awards ceremony. They had singing and they're still going on. They're still partying in the background. So I apologize to all of our audience who may join. And if you hear any background noises, it's not me partying. I will join them afterwards.
It's a lovely thing to be a part of and to see and experience.
Absolutely. I was very touched. They actually presented me with a Namibian calendar autographed by all the kids and the teachers, and gave me a little certificate. Oh, it was so sweet. I felt like I was a school kid again. They even took a photo of me, and you should see the most stupid grin on my face, this cheesy grin.
Super proud. You're like the high achiever.
I feel like a kid. It was so sweet, very touching, and makes it all worthwhile, right? I mean, you're a teacher, Belinda. Let me introduce you, actually. But for those who don't know, I'm getting so familiar with you, Belinda, like an old friend. So I haven't even bothered to introduce you formally. It was like a one-on-one chat, but we have an audience to join us. So let me start out formally by introducing myself. For those of you who don't know, I'm Hugo Mendes. I'm a CambriLearn education consultant is my title. I do specialize in supporting our trusted partners, our affiliates, who are our support network, who actually facilitate the learning at their sites or online. And I'm joined tonight by Belinda Backwell, who is our principal of the primary school. And Belinda,
I'm shaking my head because I'm not the principal. I know that's
the head of what is your official title?
I love that you're trying to promote me, but I'm the head of the primary school.
Head of primary.
So stage 1 to 6 I look after. I look after our team of teachers. There's 11 of us actually in the primary school team. Oh, really? And so yeah. So that's my official title.
That's your official title. But I just wanted to say, talking about affiliates, that you actually were once at one of our affiliates, right?
Absolutely. That's how we got to meet and how we now ended up on this journey with CambriLearn, was that we were an affiliate of CambriLearn. We had a therapy centre with a team of occupational therapists and speech therapists that became an affiliate of CambriLearn to provide support for those children that have learning difficulties or challenges. And funnily enough, that's one of the aspects of my role at CambriLearn, is to look after the concessions for the primary school children.
Thank you. And I'm going to introduce Brett briefly now, because he will be joining us. So we're going to be joined by the Deputy She looks to unfreeze herself.
There.
So there we go. There you are. Okay. Just you were temporarily frozen, or your image was. Am I still coming on strong?
Yes, you were frozen as well. I think we had a little dip in the connection there.
Oh, okay. So maybe it's all good. All right. Okay, all good. Yeah. Welcome to online and live. Right. This is unrehearsed. And it's not scripted. So Brett was, I was just saying, Brett was also once an affiliate of ours, at a traditional school at Heritage House. He was the principal there of the high school. So there's something you share in common. And here I am at one of my affiliates, having joined their parents for an evening and their children, and I'm presenting there in Namibia. And I know that you are in Cape Town and Brett is in Franschhoek. I think, actually, I'm not sure where he's presenting. I think he's actually coming from a work function. I think he was also presenting somewhere somewhere in Cape Town. I don't think he's actually going to come from home tonight. Yeah, he normally does, but I think he's also delayed because of work. So
I think that's the beauty of online learning and our environment, is that you can do this from anywhere as long as you've got Wi-Fi.
Exactly, as long as you've got stable Wi-Fi.
Yes.
Absolutely. And the reality is you don't even need fancy tech, right? Because we just sitting.
And we're frozen again. I don't know. I'm not sure if it's your connection or my connection.
That's why we brought the heads of the respective schools. So Belinda, tell me, first of all, for those who don't know, what exams are there in primary? And I say this because in many cases, exams only begin at higher grades. I mean, where was I now where there was a school where they actually only began exams in grade 4?
Well, CAPS, when we have CAPS on board next year,
okay,
it's grade 4.
Well, there we go.
Formal
so let's
assessments.
talk about CAPS 2 tonight, Belinda, if we may. Actually, thank you for reminding me that we're no longer offering just Cambridge International, the British International syllabus. We're also offering CAPS. So, okay, I know that no one can yet prepare for our CAPS exams because we're only launching CAPS in January. But yeah, if you want to just give us a sense of when do exams get offered across the different curriculums, and what are the exams?
Well, I can talk to the primary school. And I mean, you know, what we're going to talk about tonight, I think, applies to all learners, no matter whether you're at university, high school, or primary school. But in the Cambridge system, stage 1 to 6, they have assignments and mid-tests, and then two final progression tests. However, not formal examinations as such as they would do in the Cambridge system in the high school. But nevertheless, they should still be preparing for them and revising and putting in those study techniques as they would do in any formal assessment anyway. I think it's a habit that the younger they get into those study habits, the more they sort of set themselves up for high school when they do have those formal examinations, you know, how to prepare themselves, how to alleviate themselves with anxiety. And those systems that they put in place to help them have better executive functions, become more organized, the sooner they start those habits and good study habits, the better equipped they are for dealing with those high pressured exams in high school and university. And so with the CAPS system that we'll be introducing next year, formal assessments in the form of exams start from an early age, grade 4. Now, many parents, you know, and me included, think it's a very young age to start formal assessments. But I think too, it's how you build those students up to prepare for those assessments, how they view them internally themselves. You know, many children get anxious about exams. You just mentioned that word and they're like, go into complete apoplexy. So, you know, I always used to say to my kids in my classroom, it's one test on one day. You put in the effort, and it is, you know, studying for anything is about effort. And you will reap the rewards. You know, it's not a guarantee that you're going to get 100%, but you feel good about yourself because you know you've put in the hard work. You know you've done what you needed to do to prepare yourself for that assessment, whatever it may be. And I think that's key. And I think that's what parents need to recognize too. It's not about the grade, it's about rewarding the effort that the child's put in to get there.
So tell me about how, well, in fact, no, I want to go back to something you said, because, you know, I understand what you mean, but I think for a lot of parents, that's a foreign term. What do you mean by executive functioning? Because you're quite right. It's such a predictor of academic success, sometimes more so even than IQ, right? Is that ability to self-regulate, to concentrate, to, you know, to
organize their materials,
organize, right? Self-management, right?
Absolutely.
And I don't want to define it. You know more about it than I would ever. Could you unpack that term for us, please, for our parents? Because you're quite right. That's something that is required for testing technique that is often forgotten. It's not just about mastery of the content, it's also requiring what we sometimes disparagingly call soft skills, but actually they're the most critical of skills, because they're the most required under those conditions, right, of testing, of exam.
Well, they're required in everyday life, and more and more so we see young children, very young children, with very poor executive functions. So executive functions is an umbrella term that covers a multitude of things. Like you said, it's prioritizing tasks, organization of materials, of notes. You know, you think of the kid with the exploding backpack that's got all their materials stuffed at the bottom, and the worksheets they're supposed to do for homework are crumpled up in the lunchbox. They've got poor executive functions. So a child that is not able to manage those basic essentials, some kids are fantastic at those organizational skills, but many children lack them for some reason or another, whether it be because they've got a barrier to learning, such as ADHD, or they're on the spectrum and they haven't got those organizational skills. We need to be able to help them to prioritize tasks, to give them structure, whether it be in a form of a contract or a timetable, to provide them with, what are you going to do now? How are you going to go about studying for this test? What materials do you need to succeed? You know, what materials do you need? Do you need your textbook? Do you need your laptop? So it's helping children, not doing it for them, but helping them work through a step-by-step process on how they get from A to B, studying successfully for their assignment, and making sure that they follow those steps and procedures if they need support in the area of executive functions, and that they're having a checklist for themselves. So eventually they'll get to be able to do those things independently and not need a parental support all the time. And that's what we're trying to do with the little ones, is make them independent learners, that they can be motivated to do these things on their own independently. Hello, Brett.
We did
hello, Belinda. Hello, Hugo.
Welcome. Lovely to have you. Thank you for joining us. I believe you've come from another work function.
You know, no, fortunately not. Tuesday is the very big gymnastics day. So that is my standing commitment on Tuesdays. All our homeschooler families have a big gymnastics day on Tuesday. But I was going to be at another function, yes, Hugo, but that function was postponed. So fortunately tonight I can focus on this.
And thank you very much for giving up of your private time.
Absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Belinda, Brett. So Brett, I did introduce you briefly in your absence, only because we had a lovely segue from Belinda being a former affiliate partner of ours. And I mentioned you as well, used to be an affiliate of ours. But is there something else that you want to give as background before we get into the meat of the discussion?
No, thank you. Other than that, I've been in education for far too long. Actually, no, I haven't been. I've been in education for a long time. And every day in the world of education is a new day. It's the most exciting thing. So just as I share this evening, or as I answer questions, understand that that's the mentality, or that's the approach that I take in the world of education. Many people are frustrated, and I guess rightly so. But if you sit where we sit, where Belinda and I sit, and I guess in some respects where you sit, we're at the exciting edge of education, where we can make changes, we can adapt, we can try things that will make students better able to cope with what life throws at them. And, you know, especially for tonight's topic, we can help them to deal with what exams throw at them, which at the end of the day is something you'll never get away from.
Absolutely.
I did also say, well, it was actually brought to my attention that we want to talk about the forthcoming CAPS curriculum and how the exams might be different to our British International syllabus, if we can. I know it hasn't launched yet. It's only launching in January, but you know, the principles, I guess, are universal actually across curriculums and across ages, as Belinda quite rightly said before you arrived, Brett, that this calls on skills like executive functioning that are actually life skills and are beneficial for aspects beyond just the specific scenario of an exam, of taking an exam. So let's get into the meat of it. Okay, so tips for exams. So let's start with anxiety. Belinda, you mentioned that kids getting quite nervous when they have to sit exams. So that's a common barrier. I mean, I'm sure there are parents out there and there's affiliates out there where that's actually the greatest weakness is they have mastery of the concepts. They find when they're doing their classwork or untimed assessment, but the minute they know it counts for exam marks, it's going to be high stakes, they fall apart. They're just not good exam takers. So what tips would you have there for both our affiliates that deal with these kids and our parents at home, who have children who are susceptible to exam anxiety, to testing anxiety? What's the first?
We all are.
Yeah, we all are. That's true. But to a greater and less extent, some kids just, that they radically underperform when it comes to exams in comparison to their actual natural ability that the teachers know. What would be your advice there? Tough one, I know, but I'm going to kickstart with something that I think is common when it comes to examinations.
Well, I think too, it's a process. And for me, when I'm speaking, I'm speaking generally too, specifically about the primary school age children, but I think this applies to high school kids as well. Is when you've got a highly anxious child, preparation is key. Talking about it with them, unpacking it with them, listening to their fears and anxiety. What makes them nervous? What feeling do they feel inside when they feel anxiety? And discussing strategies with them on how can they overcome it? What do you do? And give them pointers about, we all deal with nervousness and anxiety on different levels. How do we cope with it? How do we cope with the butterflies in our tummy? Some children, they have the deep breathing exercises. Some children, it's because they don't feel prepared. So how do you alleviate that anxiety and help that child feel prepared and in control? Because anxiety is when a child feels out of control. So I think it's very important to start early on. Not the night before the assessment. I think preparation is key, especially for highly anxious children. Set the scene with the child. You've got to have their buy-in, no matter how old or young they are, and they've got to take accountability and onus for the whole preparation for assessments or tests. And routine, as we know, with highly anxious children is important. It encourages them to have discipline, to prepare them for later grades when they get to high school and studying. They've got to have buy-in as to what time they're going to study, what place they're going to study in. Do they need to be somewhere where someone can observe them and keep an eye on them? Do they study better in a quiet place in the early morning, or is it later in the afternoon? And children need to have, or parents need to have this conversation with their children. What materials do they need? At their learning space, are they going to have their materials there, or are they suddenly going to disappear for half an hour because they can't find their dictionary? Because a child that's wants to avoid studying or has study avoidance is going to make every excuse under the sun not to do what he has to do. So making sure they've got everything that they need to equip them to do the job. They've got a good desk, they've got the right lighting, they've got the right learning materials. Not too much background noise, not somewhere where people are going in and out of the house. They need to concentrate. Then I always suggest to my parents when I was teaching around grade 7 class is sit down with your child and devise a personalized study plan with them. Where are they going to study? What time of the day, as I said? How do they study best? Some of our children are auditory learners. Some of them are visual learners. Do they need somebody to test them? Do they learn material and concepts better if they've got, it's almost like a game, or they're playing a memory game, they're going to match definitions. Once a child understands how they study and what works for them, they also too are more engaged in it. If it's just rote learning, it becomes laborious, it becomes a task that they're just not interested in anymore. So they need to find what works for them. I often I've got a son that needs to be sat on, even in grade 10, and he needs to be tested, and he needs to do mind maps. So he's got to make all his notes first, and then we condense them into a mind map where it's on one sheet, and it's easier for them. But I think understanding how they study and what works best for them is key, because it makes it more fun for them and more engaging. I also suggest too, for the kids that have poor executive functions, is for the parents to do a schedule, almost like a contract with the child, where they look at what they have to do in a day and they look at what they need to do. And I call it the needs and wants schedule. Because quite often we take things away from children. We say, right, you're not having your PlayStation for the whole time you've got exams. And then that forms a hate relationship with studying, I think, because they feel punished, and it's creating a negative impact in their minds. So if they create a schedule of the things that they have to do and the things that they want to do, and break it up into blocks where the child can see, well, actually, if I do an hour and a half of studying, or half an hour, depending on their age, and then I can go and do 10 minutes of this, but I've got to come back and do a little bit more. It gives them a sense of satisfaction that they can fit everything into their little schedule that they devise, and it doesn't create that want for something and a hate for the work that they have to do.
Thank you, Belinda. Sure. There's a lot there, but let's hear from Brett. Brett, what would be your answer to a child or a tutor of a child who's susceptible to exam stress and anxiety?
Look, I think Belinda's, for me, nailed it in that preparation phase, but I want to then maybe just highlight how CambriLearn, the platform, helps prepare children for exams. And obviously, I'm thinking with quite a long-term view, being a high school principal, but working across all phases. As Belinda says, you can't start at the end of the day with suddenly trying to cram for an exam. But I do want to share one thing. My maths teacher always said to me, if you want to, because we would always say, ma'am, what do I need for the exam? She'd always say, jelly beans. She'd say jelly babies, not sparkles. And her point was always, don't get distracted by the wrapper. So if that's going to help anyone, jelly babies, not sparkles. But on that note, look, the final exam that a CambriLearn student following the Cambridge curriculum, the British International Curriculum, writing CAIE exams at a big external exam center, the final exam that they write is going to be daunting. I can't downplay the fact that it's scary. Anyone who's been at university, you might not have done a Cambridge exam, you might not have done a CAIE exam at the British Council or whatever. But if you've done a university exam, for example, and you walked that very first exam that you walked into in a venue in which there were 1,000+ students, rowdy engineers, a handful of commerce students, brightly colored nails. I'm going back to my university days.
A bit of nostalgia there, Brett.
Art students who just looked completely different and spoke completely differently. All of that together, knowing that the bathroom was about 3 kilometers down the front of this massive hall, knowing that the table that I sat at was rocking and wobbly, and it just wasn't what I was used to studying. All of that jazz made my very first big exam experience quite frightening. And I think for many of us as parents and for tutor center operators or tutors working with students, we've got to get them used to the idea that a little bit of fear, some anxiety is actually normal. We just mustn't be crippled by it. So how do we stop being crippled by it? Well, look, let's start with the end in mind. So let's start at the beginning with the end in mind. When you pick up a CambriLearn assessment, let's say one of those first assignments, primary stage 1, primary stage 4, primary stage 6, and the instruction at the beginning of the assignment is do the following things like this, then that's step number 1. Do them like that. Why did the CambriLearn teacher who put that assessment together do that? Why did he say that? They were thinking about the end point, that big exam, the daunting one, the one that's ultimately going to be part of the experience. Follow the steps step by step. And we often say to parents and to students and to tutors, Do the assignments, they're pointing you towards the test. Do the tests, they're pointing you towards the progression test. Do the progression tests, they're pointing you to your big external exam. And for many students who on the CambriLearn platform follow the steps, they do the assignments and then they write the test and they go, oh, this looks a lot like an assignment. Because we're not trying to trick anyone. We're not trying to trap anyone. We're building confidence and familiarity, or confidence through familiarity. For parents in particular, I often encourage them, create an exam-like environment without necessarily creating that old-fashioned, very rigid, very strict, very angry, very scary exam-like environment. But where the teacher says, or where the instruction is to use a ruler, use a ruler. Where the instruction is to use a pen, use a pen. Where the instruction is, give me your skeleton or your rough draft and your final written essay, then please do both of those things. Many times students will submit a script and it'll just be the final version. Where's the rough draft? Why didn't you do the rough draft as part of the assessment? You see, doing it as part of the assessment means that when you get to your final IGCSE English exam, I'm going to guarantee you're going to pick up a handful of extra marks because you took the time to go through the steps. That security is going to lead to you ticking more of the boxes and getting more of the marks. I hope I'm not digressing. The other thing I really wanted to say, and that is that students in particular, when they're getting ready for exams, preparing for exams, really need to know what's going to be examined. Now, I know, Belinda, I'm quite sure, I'm not sure, maybe I'm not that sure. Certainly, I as a principal used to go to great lengths to make sure the students had something called a study scope, in which I would tell them exactly for every learning area what I expected them to have under the belt. And there wouldn't be additional stuff in there, stuff that they didn't need to know. Now, look, the British curriculum is not testing the recall of children. We're not trying to test how much did they remember from the textbook. We're trying to test how much of what they've learned can they apply in a test-like environment. So sometimes I think our study scopes, CambriLearn study scope, is going to be a little bit more overwhelming than perhaps one in a typical CAPS classroom, because we're expecting them to have quite a few skills under the belt. But having said that, where rubrics are included, I always tell students, if in an assessment a rubric is supplied, work towards the rubric. Don't sit there
aim for that high end, aim for the end mark, those top marks, and you'll be right.
Correct. So if the rubric says uses words to link, sorry, I have English as a theme at the moment, use words appropriately to link paragraphs to each other, then make sure, for heaven's sakes, you've got some paragraphs, number one, and B, that you've linked them together, for goodness sakes. Get the marks that are on offer. And that's exam technique. And it comes through practice. You, as Belinda said just now, you're not going to wake up on Friday morning knowing that on Monday morning I'm writing my maths exam and go, I'm going to quickly practice 10 papers and I'll have this under the belt. It's not going to happen.
That's one sure way to create anxiety if you didn't have it before.
It does, however, bring me to my third point, and that's practice. The more past exam papers, and again, I'm speaking about the older grades now, particularly for the exit level exams, IG exams, AS level or A level. If you want to do well, it pays to practice past exam papers. It pays to look at the mark schemes for those papers. It pays to get your tutor or your teacher or your CambriLearn teacher's input to look at what you wrote. Why did that make sense as an answer? Why didn't it get any marks? I'll use a great example. Very, very recently, I had a student who had to work out velocity. So it was X meters per second, a particular number, let's say 6 meters per second. And the student's answer was not 6, it was like 12 over 2. Now 12 over 2 is 6. But when we write velocity, when we measure our speed in a car, for example, we don't say 20 over 10 kilometers per hour. We say 2 kilometers per hour. So unfortunately, the 12 divided by 2 was incorrect, despite the fact that it equals 6. And then instead of writing meters per second, the student said meters per 10 seconds. Now, if your answer was 10 times as big, and it was per 10 seconds, then the answer would be the same, practically speaking. But we don't measure velocity in meters per 10 seconds. So the student was quite frustrated that they got the answer correct, but it was incorrect. There were no marks on offer for that particular answer, despite the fact that 12 over 2 is the same as 6, and whatever the answer is that the child was using, divided by 10 would have given the right answer. So that's the other thing, I think, is just practice, 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 but practice intelligently, not just blind practice. You know, you're not trying to spot the exam question, because the British curriculum doesn't lend itself towards rote learning. You're not trying to spot. You're trying to make sure that you understand the material so that when the question is asked, you can demonstrate that understanding effectively. And that starts on day one. I've probably written about 40 reports over the last month or two. Belinda, you've probably done 400. And nearly every senior student gets the same encouragement. And that's take every lesson and make it count. Take every assessment, make it count. Take every mid-course test, progression test, make them count, because they're pointing you towards the exit level. Practice, practice, practice from day one.
And that's the beauty, I think, to the CambriLearn dashboard, is that the students can set the assignments when they feel ready. There's not a set time. You know, if they feel like they need to do another few weeks consolidating the concepts of Unit 1 and Stage 6 Science, then do that. Only set those assignments in your tests when you feel that you understand the concepts that have been taught and can explain it. And practice writing sentences to explain it, especially in the primary school stages 1 to 6. You know, I see that a lot. You know, it's being able to use the correct terminology, especially in something that's very specific terminology like science. It needs a lot of practice. You've got to practice those spelling words too for science. You know, it's got a lot of unknown terminology that doesn't come easily to many children. And the only way you can overcome that is to practice it on a regular basis and only set those assignments when you feel that you've really got a good handle on what was taught.
So you've mentioned deliberative practice, Brett, and past papers. So we actually had some teachers being introduced to our parents, and one of them was our head of science, Brendan Page Green, and he mentioned exactly that. He said he's actually seen a direct correlation in his experience of teaching Cambridge over many years, direct correlation between how many past papers a student does and does them very deliberately. So, you know, taking the exam and under timed conditions, so simulating exam conditions accurately, you know, closed book, no assistance, doing them in one sitting, like an exam, and then marking it with the mark schemes that we do provide, so to learn from them. He says he's seen an absolute correlation. The more papers you do, generally, the better you'll have done in your final exam. Obviously,
you're more equipped, aren't you? And often too, there's a pattern in the questions that are asked. And so you become more familiar on how questions are asked and how you're expected to answer them.
Correct.
But I want to jump in there and just go back to this whole issue. You know, it's very sad that in some learning environments, and I don't mean in a tutor center specifically, but I mean in some environments, students simply cram, and there's not a real engagement with the learning material, with the coursework. And that's, you know, that for me as an educator it's a travesty. It's tragic that a student would only focus on that exit level or at that end point. So for me, and I encourage students to do as many past papers as they can lay their hands on. In fact, if I take my own matric equivalent experience, I went through my mathematics textbook. I did every single example in my mathematics textbook no less than 4 times. So most people thought I was incredibly nerdy, which I probably was. But that practice taught me a lot of things. It didn't give me answers to the questions necessarily, but it taught me a lot. So I want to highlight a couple of things about the value of practicing past papers, or just practicing in general. One is it's a learning opportunity. Things and you get it wrong. There is great value in finding out why you got it wrong. And I encourage students, don't be disheartened or demoralized if you do something and you get a poor mark. The poor mark simply allows you to hone in or identify the things that need a bit more attention. So do them not so that you get hundreds, do them so that you build understanding. So that's the first thing. Don't practice so that you just get everything right. Practice so that you know what you do or don't know. And then when you've got something under the belt, don't go and rehash it every single time. So once you know that you know it, find the things you don't know and focus on them. And then that's a very important exam technique for me, is to say to a student, once you've mastered something, it's mastered. And that's important. You've got to know that you've mastered it. It's not just I got it right 2 or 3 times out of luck, because it's the same question that I recognize and I know what the answer is. Once you've mastered it, you've mastered it. Then spend your time looking at the things you haven't yet mastered and focus on those.
And I think that it particularly applies to maths as well. Sorry, Brett. You know, maths is one of those examples of those subjects where you can't study it per se by reading out of a book. You've actually got to practice it. You've got to practice doing those equations and sums.
Correct.
At every age level.
I'll use the one that I use literally every day this week or last week. A gerund. It's an English term for a noun, a word that can be a noun and a verb. Gerund. Gerund. I'm not sure how you say it in English properly, but it's a gerund. G-E-R-U-N-D. It's a word that can be a noun and a verb. My son, who's grade 7, I'm looking out the window, I'm trying to think, is he grade 7? He keeps coming to me with this blasted word called the gerund, a gerund. And I cannot get it under the, I know what a noun is. I know what a verb is. But you know, every now and then I pull up his textbook and I read the little paragraph with a couple of examples about this blasted word, so that when I see it in practice, I'll go, that's what it is. That's that darn thing. You see, I was
give us an example. Come on, Brett. Now you've got to give us an example of a gerund.
We're testing Brett now tonight.
While Hugo takes the focus just now, I'm going to go on Google and I'm going to find a couple. That's what we do when we're not being examined. But my point is, not to lose track, my point is, practicing around the things that you don't know is actually very valuable. And again, for children with anxiety, the reason we don't want to be caught out is we don't want to be embarrassed. We don't want to go, oh, I don't know that. And many students, if I've worked with them in the classroom, will have said to me, so I hit a blank. Now, I'm not a big fan of the concept of hitting a blank, because I think if you've prepped carefully enough, you're going to know something. But it is true that if you get unsettled, it is possible that you become unsettled enough to actually feel paralyzed to move forward.
Absolutely.
So one of the other things that I like to suggest to students or encourage them to do is make a note of what you already know before you open your paper. So one of the things I would encourage a student to do is 9 times out of 10, if it's not a CambriLearn exam on the CambriLearn platform, but if it's a formal exam in an external environment, you're probably not allowed to pick up your pen or pencil and start writing until the exam starts. But what I often will say to students is, when you arrive at your exam, you probably have a fair concept of what it is you think you know and what it is that you think you don't know. So when the exam starts, turn over your page or your paper to the first blank page and make a note about the things that you do know. So I'm doing geography. What do I know? I know my cloud types. I know my weather patterns. I know what leeward and windward is. And I jot down the things that I know. And then a couple of things that I don't know. I'm not terribly good with the stuff about the ocean and where the ocean meets the shore and when pieces of land are eroded. There's all sorts of funny names. So I just make a little note about that. Then I start with my exam paper. Before I even start answering, I read carefully through the whole darn thing. The time is ticking away, so I have to factor that reading time into what I'm busy doing. And sometimes you'll get reading time without being allowed to hold a pen. So then you just need to swap those two things around. But read through the whole darn paper. As you're reading through the paper, you're going to go, oh, that's one of the things that I remember knowing. That's my mastery section. There's my mastery section. There's my mastery. Oh, question 3.2. I'm going to come unstuck here. I'm already prepared. I know that when I get to 3.2, I go, don't stress. Don't stress. In my brain, the cogs are turning. They might not get there in time, but they're turning. I'm going to come to 3.2 just now. Let me go and do 3.4, 3.5. I know that I know those things. And 9 times out of 10, while I might not answer 3.2 properly or completely or 100%, 7 out of 7 marks, say, I'm going to pick up 3 marks. You know, 3 out of 7, that 40 odd %, added to my other 60, 70 or 90 odd % is going to mean that I get my C, B or A. Hopefully in our situation, because it's CambriLearn, A stars throughout. But again, that's exam technique where particularly for tutors and tutor centers, you need to start practicing that at an early age. If a child gets stuck somewhere, help them understand that being stuck is not a problem.
We always say that to the younger ones. Absolutely. Don't sit on a question for 15 minutes becoming more anxious and more uptight because you don't know it. You've got to freak your little brains out. Move on. Move on. And most of the time there'll be a question related something to that in there. You can go back to it. You know, and it doesn't mean, you know, if you move on that you failed. You just carry on and do the ones you can do and feel confident in yourself, and then come back to it at the end. It's a good tip. It's a good tip, and I think that's a lot of children become unstuck on is when they sit there and they dwell on that one question that's worth 1 mark. Sometimes you think, you know what, put it behind you, move on.
Look, Belinda, of course, sorry, Hugo, Belinda, of course, there are some students for whom that is a real hurdle that cannot be cleared, because there are, and you've mentioned children on spectrum. There are some children for whom those particular hiccups become almost insurmountable. And that's a different conversation. And I think for tonight, I understand we're talking about exam in general. There are some students for whom the management process is quite differently and overtly different. So if you are looking after a student like that, if you are a student like that, or if you have a child like that, or you have a tutor center that focuses on students like that, you will have different strategies. But in general, rule of thumb, get a sense of what you're up to. When you get stuck and it's not part of the plan, move on, come back.
And that's where a reader and scribe, you know, helps for those kids if they've got it as an accommodation in their ed psych, you know, that will help alleviate that fixation on that one question, that will help prompt them to move on through the test. And there's nothing wrong with that either. It's whatever helps them to get through and provide them with those strategies. And that's where starting from an early age too, and educating them, getting them into good study habits and getting them to have a positive mind frame about their approach to work and studying, even from stage one. You know, yes, it's going to take an adult, a tutor or a parent sitting with the child, you know, and I always do the key vocabulary matching and definitions and little games like that for little ones, because that's how best they learn. You know, they like to be hands-on and they need somebody to engage with them and test them, so they get confident in that. But having that positive mindset from an early age, I think it sets them up for life.
So you've mentioned exam technique, and I think you've mentioned a lot of techniques when it comes to handling exams. So I'm going to ask this because I remember being told this at school, and would you agree with this? Because I don't even know if this is actually outdated thinking, but you do not have to answer a question paper in sequence. In other words, you can jump around. You can omit, for example, that 3.2, you know, that section that you know, having scanned the page in advance is going to trouble you. You can omit it initially, maybe come back to it later if you have time, but tackle the questions that you find easiest or that you have most mastery in first, which may mean you leave out the first question or the first couple of questions, or you start at the back, start at the end. Would you suggest that? Is that a valid way of tackling an exam paper?
Absolutely. Because the ones you feel more confident, you know, even at the younger ages, the ones you feel more confident about, you're going to rattle off the answers straight away.
There is one caveat. And the caveat is that sometimes your script needs to have the answers in order to allow the markers or the teams of markers who are marking those papers to mark them effectively. So for example, if your paper started 3.2, 2.1, 3.7, 3.3, 9.9, 2.6, that structure is going to throw the marking team big time, because for many of the bigger X-level exams, that paper is not marked by one person. It might be marked by a team of people who will take sections of the paper and mark them at different places at different times. So what I would recommend is there will be an instruction on the paper, and the paper will 9 times out of 10 it'll say, record your answers in order or in sequence. It doesn't mean you have to answer them in that way. I always tell students, you've paid for your exam, and again, this is exit level exams, not necessarily the CambriLearn exam. You've paid for your exam. There's no limit on the number of books or pages you can use. Use as many as you need. So if you're going to start at 1.3 and not 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, look at how many marks the question is worth. And this is another exam technique, is look at how many marks your questions are worth and then make sure you answer appropriately. But look at how many marks question 1.1 and 1.2 are worth. Leave an appropriate amount of space and then write 1.3 and answer the questions you know. Just make sure to go back to 1.1 and 1.2. And if you do leave out 1.1 and 1.2, at least write 1.1, put a line, 1.2, put a line, so that the marker is led through your paper. Because at the end of the day, the marker is doing a job. The marker is following a mark scheme. They're not in your head. It might sound very logical to you, but you're helping the marker understand what it is or where it is that you're answering the question. Just on the note of marks, one of the things about the British curriculum, I think in CAPS, we like the idea that 1 mark is 1 point or 1 comment or 1 idea. So it's 10 marks. So I write 10 bullets, job done. It doesn't work like that with the British curriculum, unfortunately, because there you might have 10 marks for something that in the rubric says a coherent answer that illustrates an acceptable level of understanding by the student. 5 marks. A somewhat coherent answer that suggests the student knows something. 1 mark. The student was able to write something down on paper. That sort of thing. So again, students writing, particularly for the British curriculum, benefit from the practice, and they'll see this in their assignments and in their mid-course tests platform. But yes, Hugo, probably you and I come from, well, I probably come from a little bit longer ago than you. In those days, it sounds like the Oxwagon days. In those days, it was actually entirely appropriate to write 1.1, 3.4, 5.5. It was never really an issue. And then later on, when more and more students were being marked centrally, it became important to have the script in order. But you can always answer the questions that you feel comfortable with first, and then you go back to those problem ones. Just leave some space.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Of course, I was just thinking it's easier when the answer script is the question paper, if you know what I mean, where you're answering on the question, where they leave you the lines and the blocks, to answer within, because then it's very easy to move around the paper. Of course, beware, I also remember this, of omitting a question in error or forgetting an entire page, right? That can also happen. Unfortunately, when you jump around a lot, you can actually just entirely miss a question.
Or you run out of time.
Or you run out of time. So, well, actually, that's a very good point, Belinda. Pacing. How does one time, that's often what brings the anxiety on, right? Which is why one of the concessions, other than a scribe or reader for language difficulties, is often time, extra time, right? Because time is a big part of examinations, of tests, right? Time constraints and pacing yourself. Any tips on that? Like how should a child pace themselves?
Well, for primary school age, it's still, especially with CAPS coming on board where we have the exams at an early age, I always say to them, look how many sections there are in the examination and what your set time is, and then split it up roughly. So if you've got 2 sections and it's 60 minutes, you can spend roughly half an hour on each thing. Bearing in mind, you've got to read through as well. So I think they've got to learn how to pace themselves. Also, they've got to work out how many, marks the questions are. If there's lots of 1-mark questions in a section, it's going to be quicker to answer than if there's the section that's got questions that are worth 4 or 5 marks each. They're going to require a longer time period. But I think if they roughly can break it up, allocating at least 10 to 15 minutes reading time beforehand. As Brett said, some exams allow you reading time before the exam officially starts. And then you can gauge when you're doing your read through, okay, how much time am I going to spend on each section roughly, and try and stick to that. I think it does give them a good indication that they're not going to miss any questions out at the end, but also to leave themselves with at least 5 minutes if they can. Some kids don't. Some kids are like writing flat out to the last second, to be able to check through the paper. I think so many kids could have 5 minutes just to check through their paper to make sure they haven't missed any questions, to make sure that they haven't answered incorrectly, just to read through it and say, okay, I'm done. It would help a lot in them going away from that assessment feeling a bit more confident. I think a lot of children too run out of time because they're stressed.
Correct. And Hugo, we're chatting primarily, I think tonight, to affiliates, and this is one of the great areas of influence for a tutor working with a student, is to school them in time management in an exam, because it doesn't come naturally. You're anxious, you're excited, you're nervous, you're stressed. It's 100 marks in 60 minutes. How many marks a minute is that? If it was 60 marks in 60 minutes, I'd know, but now it's 100. Now I'm confused. I didn't bring a calculator. What? Whereas if you've been practicing that already, if you've been getting used to the idea of doing an exam or test under exam-like conditions, it becomes a lot easier to process. The other side where a tutor can be extremely useful is to teach children that it's okay to not know, or okay to leave something and come back to it later. So if you get stuck, one of the key benefits to knowing that you're stuck is to not waste time being stuck. So I've gotten to something, I don't know what to do. I'm going to move on. I'm going to gain time somewhere else through the sections that I do know, and then I'll come back with more time at hand, and I'll then be able to apply my mind. So there, that again, it's not a natural thing to sort of give up before I've even started. A tutor will help you by helping you to understand you're not giving up. You're being very clever. You're being smart. You're buying extra time. And then the other thing I just wanted to say about the time issue, I forget now what I wanted to say about buying some time.
But these are all strategies. It'll come to you in a minute. It'll come to you in about 5 minutes, probably. These are all strategies for learning. That kids, need to that it's normal to feel like this, and that it's okay. But how are you going to get through it? And that's we're talking about it, whether it be with the parent or the tutor. That these feelings are normal. But what's going to get you through? Okay, how are you going to overcome that little hurdle? And adults have these hurdles too, and we're, I think, more life experienced to work out how we get through them and how we navigate our stresses and anxieties. But children are still learning, and I think it's up to us as their educators and their tutors and their parents to talk them through it, and help them acknowledge these feelings when they arise. But also give them strategies on how they're going to deal with it.
I have remembered, I quickly want to add my third question.
Please, go ahead.
And that's the long questions. Just, often when students hit a long question, and you've alluded to the long question, often when students hit a long question, they want to rush ahead. And I always caution children, don't rush ahead with a long question. If you were taught to do, for example, a skeleton or an outline, or make a mind map, or do something, there's some sort of technique that you've used to make sure all the important points are there, then don't skip that step. Because in the excitement of writing the exam question or answering the question, or the nervousness or whatever, sometimes you don't realize how ridiculous your answer is. Whereas if you have something to lean back on, like your mind map or your skeleton or your list of bullet points in the margin, then that helps you to shape and grow a proper answer. And again, that's a practice issue. If you haven't been practicing that in the run-up to your exam, it's unlikely you're going to do it on the day. It's again one of the massive strengths of CambriLearn platform is every assignment is pushing you towards the test. Every test is pushing you towards a progression. Every progression test is pushing you towards that exit level. And if you've done it for long enough, and if you've done it properly, you're going to get to the final hurdle and you're going to go, wow, it's as though I've done this before. And hopefully you have.
So we are running out of time, but there was one question I wanted to ask you, which often comes up from tutor centers and parents, but especially tutor centers, the assignments which are downloadable by the students themselves on CambriLearn, the tests and exams are not. They have to be downloaded by the invigilator. You have to appoint an adult because those have to be timed. You know, they have to be done under controlled conditions, but not the assignment. The question often posed is, but should they use the assignments as test rehearsals? So is there a benefit to actually taking the assignment and making them do them like tests, so under timed conditions? So for example, you know, if the test would be 50 marks for an hour and the assignment's 25 marks, then to say, okay, then you only have half an hour to do this. Is that advisable? Is that something that can create more opportunity again for simulating exam conditions and for practicing timing and pacing and mark allocation as a guide? Really?
Yeah. And I don't know about you chaps, but when I was at school, we used to write our own tests. We used to make up our own questions and tests. We'd get out our textbook and our exam pad paper, and we would make up our own questions, close your textbook, and then answer them. I mean, there's nothing stopping in a tutoring centre environment too for the kids creating little mini tests for each other. You know, they're learning material, they're studying, and they're making, they're testing each other. But those assignments are brilliant for revision work, so long as that they can also make sure they're getting the right answers, and at the end that they're doing the check, that they're going back, where did I go wrong? Let me look at this unit again. There has to be some point of reflection in doing it that way, Hugo, because otherwise they could be making a critical mistake all the way through because it's not been corrected or they haven't checked on it. But the assignments for sure.
Brett, is there anything you want to add to that? Would you agree?
I was going to say what she said. It's 100% right.
Yeah, 100%. So this idea that assessments are continuous and they are formative and then eventually summative, that also, I think, addresses a big concern amongst our clients, families and tutor centers about bulk submissions. Because you touched upon it, Belinda, you're missing the point if you're submitting assignments bulk. Is what I mean by that is sending in 5 assignments at one go for the same subject. Because of course you're allowed to submit for different subjects simultaneously.
They're not having the time to reflect. Is Hugo frozen, or is it us? It must be the Windhoek.
Yeah, I think it's Hugo. Keep going though.
Yes, so they're not having the time, Hugo, to reflect on the markers' comments and the feedback. So I've noticed it quite a bit too, that the students maybe complete multiple assignments in one go. That's not advisable either, because the assignments are. I've studied this unit, I've learned it, I've attended my Q&As and my live lessons. I'm now going to show what I can apply and what I have learned independently. And having that feedback from the marker is crucial in helping them when they move on to the next unit. And if they're not reviewing the teacher's comments or marks on the assignment, how are they improving for their next assignment? And that's why it's important not to bulk submit. Yes, in extenuating circumstances when something's happened and the scanner's gone broken or something and they couldn't upload and they've now got all these assignments sitting there, we make exceptions, but it's in the students' best interests when they get their marked assignments back to sit and go through it. Where did I go wrong? Why didn't I get 100%? Look at the feedback the teacher's providing and sort of cement that for next time. Okay, when I'm doing my next assignment, what were the comments did my teacher make me? I've got to try and write in full sentences. I've got to use capital letters and full stops consistently, and make those improvements, because then we're not growing as learners if we don't.
Thank you. Brett, would you agree? I'm sure you do. Oh, well, there we go.
Absolutely.
Brett is
baking.
I'm aware that our time is always up and I needed to give you the answer to that question.
Thank you for that English lesson, Brett. So on that note of baking and gerunds, I'm sorry we ran out of time. I'm sure we could have gone into more depth about this, but I think it's been a good start. It's the first of its kind. Actually, we've never had a webinar before specifically on exam tips, believe it or not. So I think we'll do this again. I'm sure there will be a repeat. But thank you so much for your time, for giving up your family time, your private time in the evening. I really appreciate you sharing all this information. I certainly learned a lot, and I think you've spoken to a lot of the concerns and doubts amongst our partner community. So, Belinda, Brett,
pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Go and enjoy your party.
Yes, I'm off to a party, Brett, at an affiliate. Go well.
Thank you, Hugo. Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everybody. Good evening.
Yeah. Bye. Bye.